Hello everyone, happy Pride Month! This is Fionapollo. It's rant time. This is a rant video, I'm so sorry. I saw something that bugged me and I want to get my words out, and it's during Pride Month too. How on brand. So I'm going to be real with you all for a second and say that as I get older, I seem to be getting more mellow, or maybe just more exhausted, I don't know, in regards to the finer details of things that feel important to me. Back when I was like 16, 17 and suddenly learning about the wonders of social justice and equality, and also coming to terms with my own sexuality, I got very easily wound up about just how much injustice there is in the world. I still do, to be honest. Probably doesn't help that I was an alt kid as well, which has a history of angrily trying to fight an unfair system, but don't think I suddenly don't care anymore because I grew up. What actually happened was more so the realization and acceptance that I am one person and therefore can't take on the world by myself, as well as the fact that everything has its own bubble of context. When you understand or at least try to look into how or why something is the way it is, it can surprisingly become a lot harder to get angry depending on what it is. Honestly, that's kind of the basis for this channel. I also realized after my teen years ended that one thing that you just cannot do in the world when it comes to most circumstances is make generalizations about something with the idea that a single scenario is the cause of all problems, and the removal of it is a cure-all solution. Which brings me to the topic of this video. I don't know if you're all aware of this, but the queer community can be kind of protective of its own goings-on and what goes into it, specifically in regards to things like safe zones for the community to feel, well, safe in. And this very much extends into what is considered acceptable or morally correct when it comes to pride marches. Pride parades are a huge aspect of queer culture, which results in some pretty intense debate as to what, who, how, and why things should be conducted within them. After all, the more curated and exclusive something is, the more protected it feels from becoming sullied, right? At least that's how some people seem to view it. This heavy curation and scrutiny is what often causes a lot of the issues I discuss in other videos regarding queer entertainment. We want queer representation to be accurate, but also hopeful or positive, but also help non-queer people to understand and empathize with our struggles, but also give us a reprieve from it. And because of this compulsion for queer rep to pack all of that in at once, in addition to just, you know, general homophobia and bigotry making things a lot more difficult than they need to be, this tends to be why any properties with queer leanings tend to be criticized and beaten down so much more often, and even by its own target audience. And it feels like this is only getting worse as the years go on, as more time is put between events such as Stonewall and the AIDS epidemic, which were very significant events, and the influx of newer generations who have grown up with better queer rights and acceptance overall, but have significantly more distant knowledge and understanding of how they obtain those rights in the first place. And that in itself leads to some pretty interesting takes, and that ultimately brings us to what I'll be discussing today. I want to talk about straight people at Pride events and whether or not they should be permitted to attend. We'll be going over where this whole idea came from, the possible thoughts behind it, and whether or not it's warranted. So if you'd like to hear my thoughts on that, then please continue watching and feel free to provide your own thoughts in the comments. Also, please consider liking and subscribing too. I'm mostly an art and animation channel, but I'm also an ace lesbian, so discussions of LGBTQ+ topics will pop up from time to time. Please note that a lot of what I say in my videos is purely speculative and not based in fact unless evidence is given to state otherwise. I'm just a girl on the big wide internet, and I don't have any help besides audio editing when it comes to these videos, so feedback is greatly appreciated. Okay, without further ado, let's get into it. Just FYI, I am mostly going to be using the queer community as a catch-all term instead of the LGBTQ+ community, mostly because A, I feel like the word queer works as a better umbrella term as opposed to the acronym that only verbally accounts for a certain number of individuals, and B, it's just a lot easier for me to pronounce. So this whole discussion kicked off with a tweet, because of course it did, from a Twitter user stating, "This has nothing to do with anyone being bisexual, but I don't want your cishet BF in a queer space. Like, leave him at home, don't bring him to Pride. Don't bring him to Chapel Roan. Why would a man be there?" Okay, first off, I'm gonna preface this by saying that OP has stated that they were being satirical and that this isn't a serious tweet, and I feel like that was pretty obvious, so don't go witch hunting please and thank you. But that rhetoric didn't appear out of nowhere, and I have definitely seen people debating stuff like this before in a serious tone. So I'm still gonna use it to illustrate my points in this video because it's what kickstarted the conversation in the first place. So ignoring the fact that men, just like women and MBs, can listen to and attend concerts for whatever music height they want, these kinds of comments are something I've been seeing a lot more recently. I'd probably say since about 2020. They were around before then in smaller increments and were usually relegated to places like Tumblr, but since queer rights have become much more of a, dare I say, mainstream thing, and ever since more people have become heavily engrossed in online spaces like social media, it almost feels like these kinds of attitudes have become a lot more frequent, despite any kind of satire or irony attached to them. And it's also a lot more common from what I've observed with younger generations, which makes sense, but it doesn't make it any less frustrating because it's already pretty hard to change people's minds or get them to understand something from a different perspective when they're an adult. I remember being in my late teens and even early 20s and just being so annoyed that my parents didn't have the same views as me and couldn't understand why I felt so strongly about certain things. People are typically more inclined to take things at face value online, which, when you're trying to pass judgment or make a comment on a very broad topic, that doesn't really bode well, especially online where they risk being scrutinized for not having all the facts before speaking on something. What also doesn't help matters in the modern age is the general disconnect between real life and the online sphere. We are constantly bombarded with think pieces and news relating to specific things, and all of this can consolidate into a very lopsided worldview of what's actually happening on the other side of your door. It makes things feel a lot more urgent, a lot more severe, a lot more immediate. It also doesn't help matters that many people now get most of their news from social media, which has the potential for fake news to be spread around. Though with that, many are thankfully still quite skeptical of how much of that news is in fact trustworthy. Fact-checking has become a lot more normalized in online culture, which is at least one positive, I guess. That's not to say that these things aren't happening or that they should be ignored though, but more to do with the fact that social media is very good at not just making it feel like there is less positive aspects to something, but it's also good at making you engage with things in a negative way, even if it might feel like you're trying to do something good. Biting back against a poor take, a witty comeback against a known bigoted account, getting a one-up on an account over an incorrect source, ratioing someone, etc. Online activism is just notoriously pessimistic, which is how we end up with a lot of very nihilistic viewpoints. What's also quite funny about seeing these kinds of takes is that I remember going through all of this before on Tumblr, which seems to be about 5 to 10 years ahead of all the discourse until it resurfaces on another platform. Usually Twitter, almost always Twitter, but sometimes TikTok. What seems to be different now though is that communities on Tumblr were considered much more like niches back then, and that included the queer community. A vast majority of communities on Tumblr in particular saw themselves as these social outcasts. You had your fandom nerds, your hipsters, your soft grunge girls, before they all became more well-known on places like TikTok. And so because of that, they weren't really as outspoken about their views outside of the platform because they were perceived to be a minority and were much more susceptible to discussion and essentially agreeing to disagree for fear of being jumped on. So when you see people on Twitter and TikTok throwing out wild takes and then fighting for their life in the replies, you can't help but get a little nostalgic, you know? I will say, it is bizarre seeing how much more comfortable people are with sharing potentially controversial opinions online compared to a decade ago. But in a way, it also makes sense considering the people exhibiting these behaviors were born into a world with social media and weren't really advised to be careful about what you say or how you speak to people online compared to past generations where IRL social conventions still held some weight even on the internet. But with that said, going back to Tumblr communities and such, that was also probably a lot of people's first exposure to communities that were openly inclusive of the queer community and even encouraged things like queer headcanons for existing characters in various series, which in turn created a bigger push for queer acceptance and representation in various series once these people grew up and got big people jobs. Especially in entertainment, sometimes this was really successful and it was celebrated vehemently by fans, such as the ending of Avatar Legends of Korra when Korrasami became canon. If you look back at a bunch of people's reactions when that happened, it was honestly really wholesome, and it wasn't even that explicit, they just held hands and looked into each other's eyes. But it was enough to show that people were eager for this kind of rep in places like cartoons, which had a large, loud, and active fanbase online. Where this started to become tricky, however, is when we bring in the jokiness and satire. So, does anyone remember the Steven Universe Down with Cis meme? NANI? This meme was created as a direct response to the outrage of non-queer people towards the cartoon Steven Universe, which is one of the most groundbreaking cartoons to date when it comes to introducing people to concepts like non-binary people and queer relationships, all while teaching kids and adults alike to be understanding and respectful of all manner of individuals. However, because it was one of the first and most prominent cartoons to do this, it became a target for a slew of criticisms and attacks from people claiming it was woke trash or poisoning children's minds or whatever. Several episodes got banned in multiple countries due to homophobia, and there was even petitions made to censor episodes like Jailbreak, where Ruby gives Sapphire a kiss. Not on the lips, mind you, it was just a smooch on the cheek at that point, and the show only got gayer to the point where that became a meme in of itself as well. Thankfully, Steven Universe persisted, and none of this really bore much consequence on the actual show. So because these people's efforts weren't having the desired effect, now that queer acceptance was on the rise, people started to dunk on it, making jokes about how the gays were going to overthrow the straights and all of that, until it eventually culminated in things like the down with cis meme that ended up sparking a lot of backlash from people who weren't in on the joke and thought people were being intentionally malicious. And so that ends up becoming a bit of a vicious feedback loop. Queer people make jokes at straight people's expense online, they get relentlessly harassed for it, causing other queer people to double down when it's clear these people are just lashing out and their actions won't have many real-world consequences outside of being online. What does create a bit of division with this though is when other queer people also chime in to explain that, hey, I know this is a funny joke, but like, also people are taking you seriously and other queer people are getting harassed over it, which is a very legitimate concern. And that essentially seems to be what's happened here, albeit the current situation is definitely much more suited to an open discussion as opposed to the down with cis meme, since that was very clearly unserious, but I digress. All of this, I hope, helps to contextualize where this manner of thinking might have come from, but it doesn't answer the actual question it poses, now does it? So, should straight people attend Pride? Yes! The answer is yes, they absolutely should. There are so many reasons that straight people, especially cisgender, heterosexual men, should be at Pride. As per the norm with my videos, I like to ask you guys your thoughts on the topics I discuss, and yeah, pretty much everyone was in agreement. Straight people are fine to attend Pride, so long as they're not being assholes, they're being supportive, and, you know, just showing the same amount of courtesy as you would expect from anyone in pretty much any other social setting. That's just kind of an expected thing of any decent human. Don't be a dickhead, simple. And on top of that, how do you even know they are cis or straight? Just because a seemingly straight couple are walking around together doesn't mean they are. One or both could be queer, they could be a trans straight couple or an ace couple. Like, there are so many possibilities that trying to pass a visual judgment at Pride of all places is pretty ridiculous, and doing that only perpetuates the idea that queer people have to look a certain way, which in itself already leans pretty dangerously into stereotypes, and some pretty negative ones at that. Not every gay man is super effeminate and speaks like a valley girl, and there are also plenty of outwardly effeminate straight men who have girlfriends, wives, and families. I'll be completely honest with you, this also tends to be why I personally don't like to give the term gaydar much credence, because there is genuinely no way to tell whether someone is or isn't queer based on socially constructed indicators that are not always reliable, especially not when they're prone to being outdated. 30 years ago, the sign for being a lesbian was to look like you were part of a biker gang, and nowadays, a supposed giveaway is whether they're wearing some really weird and funky earrings, which, not gonna lie, if I had my ears pierced, I would be all over that, but whatever. Oh god, another thing with this as well that I read about is how people are apparently complaining of a shortage of butch lesbians, and I can't help but laugh about that, because why do you think that is? Why, in a society that as of late has just gone completely off the rails when it comes to radical feminism and transphobia, do you think less women are presenting more masculine or butch? Surely that can't be anything to do with how people treat trans women in particular, can it? How certain rights are being peeled back, more verbal and physical attacks are taking place. This kind of bigotry very seldom targets a single demographic, because who else is often accused of being manly and not fitting a very narrow standard of beauty? Non-white women, especially black women, women with unconventional features, women who are deemed unattractive, fat women, women who like to cover up or even just wear baggy clothes, and so many more. All of these fake statements about wanting to protect women only benefit a very small percentage of them, like, be for real. This also tends to be why so many people find it so difficult to accept individuals who are assigned male at birth can also be non-binary, because so many people have conditioned themselves into believing that all men are the enemy. There are a lot of bad men out there, but trying to lump the ones who are making a visible and conscious effort to support their friends and loved ones with those men is so counterproductive and only serves to exacerbate this existing problem we face. How are straight people supposed to learn, understand, and accept something if they are barred from entry? And if you're gonna treat all men as irredeemable lost causes who only set out to hurt the people around them, what makes you think that's going to incentivize them to behave in any other way? One person also made a pretty interesting observation about how this discussion about cis-het men at Pride is only ever seemingly brought up when it comes to bisexual girls dating men. There are plenty of brothers, dads, friends, etc. who also attend Pride, but they're hardly ever the focus of this kind of thing, and sadly, a lot of that has to do with biphobia. Despite bisexuals being one of the biggest groups of the community, because their orientation includes attraction to straight people, many straight and queer people alike try to use it as a gotcha to insinuate that these people are not in fact queer at all. It's just another form of gatekeeping, and I hate it, because the exact same thing also happens to asexuals bisexuals who get called prudes or celibates, and sometimes even incels, which is ridiculous. It's extremely short-sighted and gives off the impression that straight men are, in a way, scapegoats for people in the queer community who have experienced a lot of prejudice to exert some form of power in turn. And that is understandable in a lot of ways, but it's also not really a fair thing to do when it's targeting people in a group who haven't actually done anything to you. Ultimately, I get the drive to want to preserve the integrity of what it means to be queer, which a lot of people tend to view as being synonymous with pride celebrations, but there are other ways to do that. One way that I could see this being a lot more understandable is with corporations and the whole concept of rainbow capitalism. A lot of corporations will absolutely try to pinkwash themselves for pride, but don't actually put any effort into supporting their queer staff or customers. And it's also not just corporations, even countries and the like do this as well in order to paint countries with less developed human rights for various groups as inherently bad. In this instance, I think corporations should have limited access and influence over the Pride Parade itself when it's so very clearly a marketing ploy a lot of the time, and they don't follow through on many values that might be expressed by the queer community they seek to profit from. But then that's still not really anti-straight, it's just anti-capitalism, because a lot of straight allies do share those values, so it's just incredibly short-sighted to try and insinuate that they don't have a place at Pride, because they do. Without them, whether we like to admit to a group having that kind of power or not, we are at the whims of people who could not give a shit about us, and sometimes actively want us dead. We need allies to support us, and if that means they're supporting us at Pride, let them. I understand the desire to have a space away from people who don't fully understand you, I truly do. And I know people get in a bit of a tizzy about straight allies taking up room in spaces made specifically for queer folk, but personally, I think that's more a case of people needing to learn the difference between straight allies and straight exploiters. Straight exploiters are the ones hosting their ladies' nights in gay clubs and treating gay people and drag queens like an attraction, not some bi girl's golden retriever boyfriend at Pride. It's also quite concerning just how quickly queer history is being forgotten, because everyone knows that Pride originated as a protest, but what many don't seem to realize is that it was also viewed as a funeral march, particularly in the 80s when the AIDS epidemic was at its height. Straight family members and friends of queer people who died of AIDS or were killed in homophobic attacks would take part in pride marches in their loved ones' memory. We also can't forget the impact of allyship when we look at situations like the UK miners' strikes in 1984 to 85. When the National Union of Mine Workers went on strike in opposition to the Thatcher government, a group called Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners managed to raise today's equivalent of £80,000 to help miners and their families survive the strike. In turn, several of these miners marched in London Pride alongside the group the following year, and the National Union of Mine Workers became the most outspoken supporters of the queer community. Pride is now primarily viewed as a celebration, but it wasn't always this way, and the fact that straight people want to participate and celebrate alongside the community as opposed to trying to shut it down and cause harm to people involved, I'd say is a testament to how far things have come. But it never hurts to look back every once in a while just to remember that fact. Even if a straight person has no queer friends, family members, or tangible connections to queerness in any way, but just wants to experience a fun day out and they are respectful and not causing any trouble, I genuinely see no harm in that. At the end of the day, we want people to see us as equals, and that has to go both ways. Just support each other. Alright, I think that's all from me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed listening to me drivel on. I really hope this made sense. I think I just got possessed to write this while the topic was fresh in my mind. Please don't forget to consider liking and subscribing. If you like cartoons, you might also be interested to know I'm currently engrossed in the indie animation scene and working on a collection of shorts centered around a queer cast called Mint and Friends. I've been working like a dog to get all the animation finished so that I can publish the first short this month, so wish me luck, stay safe everyone, and I will speak to you very soon. Have a happy Pride Month. Bye!